The One Piece, The Final War, Luffy vs. Blackbeard, Luffy vs. Emu, Zoro vs. Mihawk, the Ancient City backstory, the Void Century. These are all extremely important things that still have to happen in One Piece that fans across the globe are all eagerly waiting for. Because there's still so much left in the story to happen, there's a lot of arguments on the daily about the order of these events and how Oda is going to tackle such a long list of events in such a short amount of time. However, through the recent events of the manga, I've discovered something. The Final War is looming as this all-encompassing climax of one of the greatest stories of all time, yet we have no idea how we're going to transition into this giant war and where it's going to take place, as well as the order of events that are going to happen during the Final War. But if we look at the Final War through the lens of it being a modern-day God Valley, we can actually determine exactly where it will happen, the events that will happen during it, the characters present, and exactly how it's going to end. That's right, I've put together the entirety of the Final War, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how Oda is going to end One Piece in the biggest climax of all time. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you give it a like. If you want to keep up with weekly chapter analysis as Elbaf continues to move forward, consider subscribing, and let's get into it. So first, let's establish the two biggest things that all One Piece fans are waiting for: the Final War and the One Piece. Undoubtedly, these are the two biggest things that One Piece has been building up to for all 1100 chapters, and with these two moments comes two locations: Marijoa and Laugh Tale. Ask most One Piece fans where they think the One Piece will get revealed, and ask most One Piece fans where the Final War is going to take place. Their answers respectively will be Laugh Tale and Marijoa. But my question has always been, how is Oda going to fit almost two different climaxes into One Piece with two different locations? And also, if he does manage to do that without there being some kind of break in the middle for travel time with the Straw Hats, what is the order of these two things? Does the Final War come before the One Piece? Does the One Piece come before the Final War? Well, actually, I don't see a lot of people talking about this, but thanks to the Egghead Island arc, we now know the order of these two things. Because of Vegapunk's amazing speech outing the world government of their crimes, ending on this amazing panel, one of my favorite panels in all of One Piece, we know that the discovery of the One Piece has to come before the Final War. Now, if you don't understand what I'm saying, let me explain. The entire point of Vegapunk's speech, from a narrative perspective, was to warn the world that the world is coming to an end from the hand of the world government, more specifically Emu. That way, when Luffy's the person who liberates the world, there is sort of a cathartic audience there to witness his insane battle to liberate the entire globe. This speech was quite literally setting up the One Piece planet for what would be the grand climax, the grand finale of the entire manga: Luffy liberating the world from the clutches of the world government. Because of Vegapunk's speech, I truly believe the end of One Piece will be this climactic, cathartic moment, and in this very speech, Vegapunk himself says in this final panel, the One Piece is pretty much required to complete this task, which is why he says it all depends on who finds the One Piece. Vegapunk is literally establishing here that the One Piece, whether it's some sort of tool or some amount of knowledge, is literally required to liberate the world, and Luffy liberating the world is exactly what's going to happen at the end of the story when he defeats the world government. So because the One Piece is required for that act to happen, as Vegapunk said in his speech and in this panel, the discovery of the One Piece has to come first. If Vegapunk is saying the One Piece is required to defeat the world government and liberate the world, then that has to come first before the end of the Final War. So does that mean we'll be going to Laugh Tale and then Marijoa? Does that mean there'll be one climax with the One Piece and then another climax with the Final War and the defeat of Emu? Well, this is where God Valley comes in, and I think this is where this theory really thrives. I believe the entirety of the Final War, as well as the discovery of the One Piece, and the entire final arc of One Piece, will take place on Laugh Tale. I can't believe I missed it before, but it's become so clear to me now that everything we've been waiting for in the climax of One Piece won't be two separate climaxes. Everything is going to happen on Laugh Tale as a modern-day God Valley incident, but instead of the victors being the world government, this time it will be the Straw Hat Pirates. So now that we've established that the Final War and the discovery of the One Piece are going to happen on Laugh Tale, and that this event will be the modern version of God Valley, we can now use God Valley as sort of a character guide to see what modern day characters will be present at this battle. God Valley was a world government hunting ground, and they had stolen treasure from Pirate Island to act as sort of a prize for this hunting event. Because of this treasure, the strongest factions across the world, including the greatest pirate crews of all time, flocked to God Valley and had one of the most legendary battles of all time. And if you look at the current factions of the One Piece world today, I don't think it's a stretch to say that the same thing is going to happen when Laugh Tale is discovered. People like the Straw Hat Pirates, the Blackbeard Pirates, the Red-Haired Pirates, Cross Guild, the World Government, the Revolutionaries, I think it's safe to say that all of these people want a piece of the One Piece and are going to get involved in this final battle. However, we can actually get specific parallels to every character that will be on Laugh Tale who has a parallel to a character that was on God Valley using this giant panel at the end of Vegapunk's speech. And this is where the connections between the final battle on Laugh Tale and God Valley really start to show. First, we have the most obvious one in this panel, Shanks and Luffy, both holders of the Straw Hat, both inheriting Roger's will, Roger being probably the most active force during the God Valley incident. It's very clear who these two parallel to. They are both carrying on the will of Roger. And although Luffy is Garp's grandson, so you can also say that Garp has a connection to Luffy here, I think it's way more potent to say the parallel to Garp on God Valley will be Koby on Laugh Tale, considering Koby is Garp's apprentice. He's supposed to be the modern day version of a clean navy, pretty much exactly what Garp was supposed to represent before he went down on Pirate Island. Next, there are two characters who don't have parallels in this scenario because they themselves were at God Valley, the first obvious one being Garling. The second one, a little bit more speculative, is Imu, but I think it's safe to say that Imu was at the God Valley incident because the island ended up getting erased anyway, and that will be really important much later in this video, so keep that in mind. And while we're at it, I also want to theorize that Dragon himself was on God Valley. We know that Dragon, before turning into a revolutionary, was part of the Navy, and I think if you line up Dragon's life with the events of God Valley, the timeline makes sense, where Dragon possibly saw the events of God Valley happen, and it was the catalyst that made him leave the Navy. It's very possible that the atrocities committed in the World Government hunting game pushed him out of the World Government's regime and turned him into a revolutionary, so I'm going to go ahead and say that Dragon was also at God Valley. The next most obvious one is Blackbeard and Rox. We now know that Rox is the father of Blackbeard, so Blackbeard is obviously carrying on his will in this scenario. Blackbeard at Laugh Tale will be the equivalent of Rox at God Valley. And if you've watched my last few videos, I am a huge fan of the theory that Buggy is also the son of Rox. Although you could also say because he was an apprentice on Roger's ship, he's another one that Roger represents in the modern day God Valley incident here. But I think it's more interesting to say that he's a son of Rox, and I also think that his motivation to be the king of the world lines up a little bit more with Rox's ideals than Roger's, so we're gonna go ahead and split the panel down the middle here. Next up, we have a really interesting one with Aokiji. I think Aokiji's parallel from the God Valley incident is Whitebeard, and that'll make a lot more sense later on in this video when we talk about the mashups that are going to happen at Laugh Tale. Next up, we have Akainu. I think Akainu's parallel to the old God Valley incident is Sengoku. This is a bit of a loose one because they don't really stand for the same ideals, but the fact that they were both fleet admirals, I think this is the only connection I can really think of for these two. Let me know if you think Akainu has a different person who he parallels with at God Valley. And last but not least, we have this very shadowy figure here. If this is a character that hasn't been introduced yet, then I cannot say anything for them. However, if we assume that this is Shamrock, Shanks' brother, it's very obvious that he represents Figureland Garling in the modern version of the story. Although Garling is still alive and will probably have a major role at Laugh Tale, I think it's very clear that his son portrays his impact on God Valley in the modern version of the incident. Hopefully now you can see what I'm getting at. Not only does the severity of the incident between God Valley and Laugh Tale match, all of the characters that Oda has set up with this panel to be insanely important characters for this final war have counterparts that were active on God Valley. And I think that same rushing to the island that we saw with the Roger Pirates, the Rox Pirates, and the Navy in God Valley will happen when Laugh Tale gets discovered, probably by either Blackbeard or the Straw Hat Pirates, with all of these different factions that Oda has established already. And I think another thing is that it also gives all of these different factions a chance to thrive without extending the story too much. One of my biggest worries was that there are so many different factions in One Piece, say the Straw Hat Pirates and the Revolutionaries, who have completely different goals and purposes, so for Oda to be able to cash in on their motives and write a satisfying conclusion for every group is such an ambitious project that I worried it would extend the story by like 1,000 chapters. But if all of these groups are present at Laugh Tale on one time, it makes it a lot easier for Oda to create a conclusion that encompasses a ton of different character endings instead of spreading them all out across, say, 500 chapters. So, we've established that because of God Valley, the location of the final war is going to be Laugh Tale, and the climax of One Piece will all happen in one arc. And we've also established the modern day versions of the characters that were on God Valley that are going to be present in the final war at Laugh Tale. But now for the juicy stuff, let's talk about how the events at God Valley spell out exactly what's going to happen in this final battle and what some of the matchups will be. But to do this first, I think it's important that because we don't know what happened at God Valley, because Oda hasn't showed us the flashback yet, we should establish what we think happened at God Valley so that we can have a foundation to base the Laugh Tale War off of. So very quickly, what we know about God Valley is that the world government was hosting a hunting game here. The prize was a bunch of treasure, including devil fruits stolen from Pirate Island. As a response to this treasure getting stolen, and just the fact that there was treasure on this island, the Rocks Pirates and the Roger Pirates set sail to go to God Valley. As a result of that, Garp and a huge branch of the Navy make their way to God Valley to stop these pirates. Roger and Garp allegedly team up to take out Rocks, and in the end, the island and the name of Rocks D. Xebec are erased from history. With these details, there are two big assumptions that I want to make about God Valley before we go ahead and leap to the modern day version of the incident. The first is Roger and Garp's involvement in taking on Rocks. Although I do think Garp definitely had a big part in this fight, I think it's very likely that Roger did most of the heavy lifting and that it was actually a majority 1v1, and the world government was sort of just thrusting Garp's name into the headline to save face because they didn't want to admit a pirate named Roger alone saved the world government from such a heinous pirate in Rocks. And two, another one that I think most people can agree with, is that Imu was absolutely present at God Valley, whether it was Imu themselves or Imu possessing someone similar to what's happening on Elbaf with Gunko right now. I think it's very obvious that Imu was present during this incident, considering Rocks' name and the island itself were both erased from history, and I think it just makes sense that such a large event, an attack on the world government from some of the biggest names in the pirate industry, would warrant an appearance from the King of the World themselves to come settle things down. So now that we have those out of the way, the first and most obvious one is that the version of Roger versus Rocks that happened on God Valley is going to be Luffy versus Blackbeard and their fight for the One Piece. This is the most obvious one that I think most fans can probably put together without watching this video. It is very simply the will of Rocks versus the will of Roger, two of the front runners, two wills of D, who stand for two different things, both aiming to change the world in their own unique way. And in the same way that Rocks versus Roger likely happened before the appearance of Imu and the destruction of the island, I think Luffy versus Blackbeard is going to happen before the interference of the world government on this island. I actually think Luffy versus Blackbeard will fight over the One Piece before the world government gets involved at all, which once again plays into the fact that the One Piece is required, according to Vegapunk, to defeat the world government. I think Blackbeard will likely be Luffy's giant obstacle to getting the One Piece in order to liberate the world, so this fight is going to likely come before any world government involvement. And of course, another layup here is that Garp's involvement in helping Roger fight Rocks is going to parallel with Kobe's involvement helping Luffy fight Blackbeard. I don't think this will be entirely a tag team 2v1 because it would sort of take away from Luffy's big moment here, but I think it is absolutely set in stone that Kobe will have some sort of large involvement in this fight in the same way that Garp was helping Roger. Adding on to the will of Rocks and Roger, I think two wildcards here are Shanks and Buggy. Although it really pains me to say it because he's my favorite character, I think it's possible that Shanks gets snuffed out and dies very early into this giant conflict in order to sort of prop up Blackbeard as a villain. And I also think it would be kind of fitting as he's sort of ushering in this new era and has sort of been watching over Luffy waiting for him to liberate the world. So for him to sort of leave the story right as this is about to happen is kind of a cathartic and climactic moment. And on the other side of the coin, as far as Buggy goes, it's only important for Buggy to be at Laugh Tale here because, well, Oda loves to throw Buggy into these sort of things, but also because Mihawk is part of Cross Guild, and I think this final war setting on Laugh Tale is where Zoro versus Mihawk is going to happen. So Cross Guild definitely has to come to this giant war, but as far as Buggy's involvement himself, I don't think he'll be anything other than a gag character who sort of somehow is in this fray for the One Piece despite being probably the weakest character up to this point in the story. It's also worth mentioning that it's possible Shanks could make it past the Blackbeard fight in order to have a confrontation with the world government and his brother and father. Like I mentioned, I think the world government involvement in this fight will come slightly after Blackbeard is defeated and Luffy has the One Piece, again because the One Piece is required to take down the world government according to Vegapunk. And if we want to see some sort of interaction with the Figureland family and Shanks, it's possible Shanks makes it past the Blackbeard fight, or it's possible that Garling and Shamrock have an involvement in this fight during Blackbeard's fight against Luffy. I just wanted to mention that these two's involvement is sort of hard to predict, especially with Shanks potentially dying before the world government gets involved. So it's possible that only Imu's involvement is delayed and the world government is here at the final war at Laugh Tale pretty much the entire time. But switching gears, I think another thing that we can predict that will happen at the Laugh Tale war, based on the events of God Valley, is Aokiji's betrayal of Blackbeard. A lot of people have predicted that Aokiji is going to betray Blackbeard because his morals don't really line up. It's very clear that Oda is establishing that Aokiji has his own motives and isn't going to be entirely loyal to Blackbeard for the entire story. But the entire meaning of this betrayal changes when you look at this event as the modern day God Valley. It is extremely likely that at the battle at God Valley, Whitebeard betrayed Rocks and switched sides to join Roger and Garp in taking down Rocks. Whitebeard was never a fan of Rocks, and he was a huge friend of Roger, so I think it's extremely likely that this was the case. And now that we know that Blackbeard is the son of Rocks, I think there's a very clear parallel to Whitebeard and Rocks and Aokiji and Blackbeard. Aokiji being this insanely strong character who for some reason is following this wicked pirate. It was the same with Whitebeard and Rocks. Whitebeard found his morals and decided to switch sides. Aokiji is going to find his morals and decide to switch sides. And in the same way that Rocks was defeated, Blackbeard will also likely get defeated, partially because his strongest ally betrayed him, just like Whitebeard and Rocks. And lastly, just like the God Valley incident when Imu stooped in, erased Rocks' name from history, and destroyed the world, Imu will likely come and try to control this entire war in order to reset the entire planet from its chaos. And because at this point Luffy has defeated Blackbeard and won the One Piece, he will defeat Imu using it, whether it is knowledge, a weapon, or whatever Oda decides. This will be the final climax of One Piece. This way, the story ends all wrapped up in one bundle. Every faction left in the story gets their giant conclusion in one spot. We get the climactic moment of Luffy finding the One Piece, figuring out the Void Century, and defeating Imu, all on one condensed plotline on one island, instead of it being separated by two separate islands, two separate arcs, and one long travel intermission. Not only does it make sense for the sake of the story, it also explains why Oda kept saying One Piece is going to end in 3 years, despite all of us readers thinking there's way more than 3 years left, because he intends on ending everything in one fell swoop. There's just one piece of information, get it, One Piece, okay, whatever. There's just one thing I'm missing in this giant theory that I need your help for. While I was making this video, I couldn't stop thinking one thing. How would all these different characters get to Laugh Tale if it's gatekept by needing 4 road poneglyphs? Obviously, the Straw Hats are going to get to Laugh Tale using the road poneglyphs. It's possible the Blackbeard pirates have found a different way to get there because Blackbeard is so underhanded and cunning. And the world government and Imu likely already know where the One Piece is. Same goes for the red-haired pirates who definitely already know where the One Piece is. But as far as Cross Guild, the Marines, the Revolutionaries, I really don't know how Oda is going to make it fair for them to be involved in this battle if they just get to the One Piece island, Laugh Tale. Kind of cheesy. I think it would sort of diminish all of the work that Luffy would do to get to the island. Although it'd be cool to see our main character do it the right way. If all the other characters kind of just join in on the fight because they're following the Straw Hats or something like that, it would be a big problem in my opinion. So I want to hear from you in the comments. How are these 3 factions, the Revolutionaries, the Marines, and Cross Guild, going to find their way to the One Piece without it being this big debacle and them not having the road poneglyphs? I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say. Thanks for watching all the way through. Obviously, this is a very oversimplified and overarching view of what the final war is going to be. Sort of a skeleton that I'm going to build off of as we get closer to it. But let me know what specific details or other plot points that you think I missed. Or maybe I'm completely wrong and you have a different idea. Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you can like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.